Hi, my name's Sunny. I'm an author of this site, right? It's basically my own little personal website. And yeah, I've decided to start doing some video recordings. I've been doing some video recordings for friends of mine, and I thought actually quite a good format to talk, right? When you look at a blog, it's just written, there's a lot of words, you're not necessarily that interested, it's not as engaging as having someone talk. So I thought, hey, I'm going to do some videos. And I wanted to do some videos on anarchist praxis, right? Because I've been having that conversation with people, so it's all kind of fresh in my mind. I've got my own kind of ideas. They're not particularly they're not rad. They're not like original ideas. They're ideas that I've picked up from elsewhere over the years, and that I've just kind of milled around in my mind. And then I have my own kind of thesis to present as a result, right? So they're kind of original, but they're kind of not, right? Do you know what I mean? And so I wanted to do, and so this series of videos on anarchist practice kind of arose out of a conversation I was having with some friends, right? And I wanted to do three videos, right? And the first video, which is this video, is on anarchy as an emergent phenomenon, right? I just want to introduce a different conception of anarchy from the standard sort of anti-capitalist, anti-statist, anarcho-syndicalist, revolutionary forms that are common, right? And that actually have their roots in the movements of the past, right? And one of the things I'm going to argue is that, hey, those are forms of anarchy that evolved in movements of the past, but the world has moved on. I don't think they're relevant anymore to the modern contemporary era. You know, like if you try to fight a war today with aircraft from the Second World War, you get blown out the sky, right? Yeah, people are still using the same tools from way back in the day, right? In the contemporary era, when the world has radically moved on, I don't think that's relevant anymore. You know. So I'm gonna argue for a different model of anarchy, one that's more effective to the contemporary era that we live in, right? And that's what I call an emergent theory of anarchy, right? This notion of emergence, right, which comes from sort of systems theory or chaos theory or complexity theory, right? The idea that things can suddenly spontaneously emerge out of a system and then in a chaotic kind of way but ordered, or even though it's kind of chaotic, it emerges as an ordered phenomenon, you know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a definition of anarchy, which is my own definition of anarchy, right? I'm then going to use that definition of anarchy to show that the sort of main spheres of anarchist praxis today, which might be called like anti-capitalism, anti-statism, anarcho-syndicalism, right? Those are the main kind of forms of anarchy, right? That based upon the definition of anarchy I give, that it's dubious as to whether those are actually forms of anarchy, right? I feel they're somewhat authoritarian in nature, actually, and dominating in nature, and I'm going to argue that to you, right? And then I'm going to introduce an emergent theory of anarchy, right? Which I believe is a much more anarchic form of anarchy and a much more accurate form of anarchy. Let me just move my chair so I get comfortable. Maybe that's going to be like 45 minutes or something like that, right? And this is the first video, right? So let me get started, right? And I've got some kind of brief kind of bullet point notes, right? So from time to time I'll put my glasses on just so I can read them. So like what is anarchy, right? And it's like, well, I don't define anarchy as an ideology, right? So like people might say, oh, well, anarchy is not anarcho-syndicalism, right? Well, that to me is an ideology, right? People have taken anarchy and they've used that to develop an ideology, right? People might say anarchy is anti-capitalism or anarchy is anti-statism, but I'd say no. There is this thing called anarchy, and people have taken it and developed these different ideologies or philosophies or different forms of anarchist praxis, right? But they in themselves are not anarchy, right? Anarchy is something else, right? And so what I'm going to say is that anarchy is any kind of system, any culture, any society organised in a way to minimise oppression, right? You could say that a society that's organised, a society that's free of oppression, right? Maybe that's not possible though, right? Who knows whether that's even possible, right? So let's go with the idea that anarchy is a form of societal organisation which minimises oppression. Now, if you can get rid of it altogether, then fine, that's anarchy, right? But if you can't, if you will find that there's always going to be some, then you've minimised it. You've got the best possible societal system that you can have, right? And that's what anarchy is about, right? It's like saying, hey, let's all work for the greater good. Let's all look out for each other, and let's see what kind of society we create. And that's a society that we that will be free of oppression. And that's the goal of anarchy, right? And some anarchists might say, no, anarchy is just anti-capitalism or anti-sense. I was like, hold on, but what are you saying then that your form of anarchy is a system in which people are oppressed, right? Most people are going to say no. The idea of anarchy is you develop a system that is free of oppression. Right? Some people might be hard-nailed about it and just hard-nosed about it and just say anarchy is a system where there's no forms of domination. But if you think about it, all they've done there is say, I think domination is the fundamental form of oppression, and therefore a society without domination is a society free of oppression. Whereas I'm saying, well, let's just take a step back and define anarchy then as a society free of oppression, right? Let's not stick any ideology in there that says domination is the ultimate form of oppression, or this is or that is, right? Let's go with the idea that anarchy is a form of living as an individual where you don't oppress others and you stand up to people in your life who try to oppress you, right? And it's also a collective form of organising where we organise together to create a society free of oppression, and where that society also stands up to any other oppression going on, like from other cultures around it, right? Because anarchy as a culture is going to exist in a world in which not everyone's anarchist, right? That was one of the problems with the Spanish Civil War, right? It's like, hey, we've created a bit of an anarchist system, but oh shit, there's all these big empires out there, they're going to crush us. Done, right? So ultimately, right, any system that is oppressive is not going to be anarchy, right? People are going to be like, well, it might be free of domination, but if it's still oppressive, I don't consider that to be anarchy, right? And you may turn around and say, oh, but domination is the ultimate form of oppression. If you get rid of that, then then there's no oppression at all. I was like, okay, maybe. Don't actually know that though, right? So let's just stick with the definition of anarchy that doesn't have any kind of assumptions made. Like, we want to create a society free of oppression. That's anarchy, okay? Anarcho-syndicalism is one ideology that says, hey, we have a solution. This is how we can achieve a society free of oppression. We organise workers into trades, guilds, they form councils, and they run the bloody country, right? That's one form of anarchy, right, where they've attempted to create a society free of oppression. They've done it that way. And then there are other forms that say, hey, no, we just got to get rid of capitalism, or we got to get rid of the state, and then we'll have a society free of oppression. So it's important to start out with a clear definition of anarchy, right? And that's for me, that's the broadest definition you can have. Like, all the forms of anarchy that you see in the world all stem with this idea that we want to create a society free of oppression, whether that's just human oppression, or whether that's human and animal oppression, or whether that's human, animal and ecosystem oppression, right? Like, green anarchy embraces everything. It says, hey, look, let's just not deal with the humans, let's deal with the animals and the ecosystems as well, and say we want to create a system that lives in balance with them too, right, and doesn't oppress them too, as much as is possible. Because remember, it's theoretical. Is it possible for us to live in a society free of oppression? Well, we certainly know that we can minimise it. And so that's why I say, well, let's just take a definition of anarchy that says we seek to create a society in which oppression is minimised, right? It's minimal, right? And the important thing there, right? This is where your definition of anarchy is really important, because if you take a definition of anarchy that's like that, then that just says, hey, the goal of anarchy is to create a society free from oppression, right? Then your anarchist praxis becomes liberating people from oppression, right? If your definition of anarchy is I believe in anarcho-syndicalism, right? Then your praxis is all about organising the workers to become bosses and state, right? If your anarchy says, it's all about anti-capitalism and dismantling capitalism, then your praxis just becomes about attacking capitalism, right? If your anarchy says, hey, we just got to get rid of the state, we just attack the state and get rid of it, and then when we've got an anarchist society, then your whole praxis becomes about attacking the state or trying to dismantle the state, right? So the definition you take is important. And what I'm saying, the best definition to take is what is the broadest one, in which anarchy is seen as a means to devise a collective system that minimises oppression, right? And then you can understand the different forms of anarchy and where people have come from, right? And then your anarchist praxis becomes about liberating people from oppression. Okay, you might decide, well, the biggest form of oppression is the state. Therefore, I'm going to focus my anarchist praxis on overcoming state oppression, right? But you're doing so within a context where you understand anarchy is about dealing with oppression and trying to create a society free of oppression, where oppression is minimised. So there are other forms of oppression, right? Feminists will argue, hey, look, patriarchy is one of the biggest forms of oppression. Well, anarcho-feminists will argue patriarchy is one of the biggest forms of oppression. Therefore, as anarchists, we need to deal with patriarchy. Do you know what I mean? And that's situated within the wider umbrella of anarchy. Green anarchists will say, well, hold on, the fundamental form of oppression is our relationship with nature and ecosystems and our treatment of animals, right? Because there's not just humans, like our society, we want to extend that to the whole organic biosphere, right? In which case, most of the oppression is meted out to the biosphere and to other animals. Therefore, that is the fundamental form of oppression to deal with, right? So all of those different strands of anarchy, they're not situated nicely under the umbrella of we're trying to create a society free of oppression. And your anarchist praxis becomes about liberating people from oppression, okay? Because that's what you're trying to do, right? An anarchist society where oppression is minimised is peopled by individuals who are each free from oppression. So therefore your anarchist praxis becomes about freeing people from oppression. So with that in mind, right, what is the chief form of oppression in people's life? Is it the state? All the anti-state anarchists, right, say, oh, the state is the biggest form of oppression in people's lives. Is it the patriarchy? Is it capitalism? Is it the factory farm system that oppresses animals, right? What is the biggest form of oppression in people's lives? Hold on, I've just lost all my notes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hang on. Well, I'm going to argue, right, that actually the biggest form of oppression in people's lives is not the state, it's not capitalism, it's other people. Right? Give me an example. I have a friend who used to do. I used to be involved in Earth First, right? And you know, back in the sort of 2008, there was this campaign against coal mines in southern Scotland, Lanarkshire. I was somewhat involved in, right? There were action camps there, and there were direct actions and so on. And we did a direct action against one of the coal mines. We all got arrested for it. We all got charged, went to court, blah blah blah. So there's no confidential issues here. And I remember chatting to one of the people in my affinity group and saying, oh, and because she was talking about, oh, I'm gonna after court we'd all get sentenced, and we were all going off our separate ways. And she was, she was saying she's going to go visit her parents, right? And I was like, oh, you're going to tell them about, you know, what happened here? And she's like, oh God, no way am I going to tell my mum. She doesn't know at all that I'm involved in direct action, right? This is someone who's been involved in direct action for years. And I was like, what? Right? Here's someone who's going up against corporations and governments, ostensibly because they're oppressive and authoritarian and standing up to them, right? When actually the biggest source of oppression in her life is her mum. She's the one she can't stand up to, right? She's the one she has to hide from, that whole area of her life. And it was all her life. Her whole life was there first and organising and all the rest of it, right? Kept that from her mum and her parents because she was too scared, right? So the biggest form of authoritarianism and oppression in her life, someone who identified as anarchist and who took direct action because she considered corporations to be the biggest form of oppression, actually was just living out a bit of a lie, because the biggest form of oppression in her life was her parents, right? But she'll maintain a happy face to the parents while getting angry at the corporations, you know. So I'm arguing here that the biggest form of oppression in people's life is the social body and our social relations, right? Because things like the state or capitalism or feudalism all emerge from the social body, right? They didn't emerge on some other planet and come here and then bloop, and then force themselves on the social body. No, they emerged from within the social body, right? And they're just reproductions of everyday social relations. Okay, so it's like it's the neighbours, right? Like I remember London Anarchist Fair a couple of years ago, right? I went down to see it, and outside one of the main buildings where most of the stalls were, there was a group of communists. One of the sort of revolutionary vanguard groups. There's loads of them, right? And they spend a lot of time just fighting with each other, right? And that's all they do. They don't do anything else really. Mainly just fighting with each other. So outside the London Anarchist Book Fair, it was a small group of revolutionary sort of communists who were protesting. I can't even remember what they're protesting about. Something. I don't know. I got chatting to them, just asking them why they're here, this, that, and the other. I was talking to them, and we started talking about more general stuff. And I remember them saying, "Oh, the state is the biggest form of oppression in people's lives and working class people's lives. We've got to deal with it." And I was like, "No, I don't think that's the case, right?" If you talk to them, like I live in the middle of the city centre, Swansea, one of the most notorious areas in Swansea, right? Really poor, deprived, pretty rough, right? Like you talk to most people around here, what the source of oppression is, it's the fucking hooligans out there, right? It's the hoodlums out there. It's the people who threaten you. It's the drunks. It's the prostitutes. It's the junkies, right? That's the biggest source of threat and oppression in people's life, right? Not the state. And it's like it just seems silly to say otherwise. To say, "Oh no, the state's." It's like, no, it's not. It's people, right? It could be your parents. It could be your work colleagues. It could be your neighbours. It could be your family. Right? There's much more of an understanding, I think, of this within feminism, where they deal with the patriarchy, because the patriarchy is recognised as being a social phenomenon, right? And so it exists in the social body, friends, family, uncles, neighbours, right? Patriarchy is reproduced by them, right? In other words, it doesn't exist and then it forces itself on people. People behave in a patriarchal manner, and collectively what emerges are patriarchal institutions. Similarly here, right? Forms of oppression are acted out by people, and as a society, institutions emerge that embody them, such as the state or capitalism and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, you're dealing with social relations, right? And anarchy traditionally just ignores social relations. It ignores social relations. It said, "Oh, if we get rid of the state, everything's going to be fine. If we get rid of capitalism, everything's going to be fine." But hold on. Capitalism and the state are forms of living and acting and behaviours and attitudes that people reproduce every day. So in other words, you've got to challenge people, right? You've got to change people, right? There's no point abstracting it into something else. Like, no, people do these things, right? So I'm arguing that actually the biggest form of oppression, and I'm only talking about contemporary UK society. I can't talk about other cultures and societies around the world. For other cultures and societies around the world, things may be different, right? For them, it might well be that the state is actually the biggest form of oppression. Like if you've got a really bad dictator like Stalin or someone like that, right? Then yeah, maybe the state. But again, remember that, like a lot of the problems in Stalin's time was that fact that other people were shopping people in, right? So actually, the problems are ultimately rooted in the social body, But from time to time, extreme forms take place, which do exert a top-down effect, and so it can then be effective to cut the head off a societal institution like a tyrannical dictator, and that can ease the oppression, right? So I'm not saying targeting the state or targeting a dictator is not an effective form of anarchy, right? I'm just saying that generally, in most cases, the biggest forms of oppression in people's lives arise from their friends, their family, their work colleagues, and so on and so forth, right? In the workplace, right, it's not the bosses that are the biggest form of oppression, it's the bloody work colleagues. And the whole anti-capitalist ethos totally misses out on that. It just says, "Oh, we get rid of the bosses, everything's going to be fine." But hold on, the bloody work colleagues oppress each other and exploit each other, right? The bosses aren't just like, "Oh, all the work colleagues are all fine, they all love each other. If only you got rid of the boss, everything would be fine." So no, the boss comes from that environment, right? And the work colleagues It's not. They're just as bad as anyone else. It's like people who target capitalism, right? As though everybody else isn't capital. Like they say, oh, the rich. Let's eat the rich, right? Classic sort of capitalist, classic sort of anti-capitalist slogan, right? Let's eat the rich, as though the rich are the capitalists and everybody else isn't. Well, hold on, like the working class are capitalists as well, not just the rich. The rich are the wealthy capitalists, and the working class are the poor capitalists. But they're all capitalists, right? They all buy into the system, right? If the working class had the chance to be bosses, they take it, and they do take it, right? They get promoted and they become bosses, and then they lord it over others, right? And they endorse the idea of making profit of other people and having private enterprise and so on and so forth. So they're all capitalists. They're just not as good at it as the wealthy capitalists, right? Some people are better at capitalism than others, so they become wealthy. Other people are not so good, so they become poor, working class capitalists. But they're still all capitalists. So it's a bit unfair to blame the rich for capitalism when everybody endorses it and everybody lives and breathes its values and acts it out. Not everybody, right? I don't. I don't. I mean, I'm not totally anti-capitalist. My position is a bit more complex, but I'm not into sort of greed, you know, and oppressing other people to exploit them for their labour. You know, I'm not into that, you know. But most people are, right? A lot of people are, right? So it's a bit unfair to blame the rich, you know. The problems exist in the social body, right? I wanna kind of like take that idea of anarchy as a system in which oppression is minimised, right? And apply that to some of the standard forms of anarchy that we have today, like syndicalism and anti-capitalism, right? Just those two, and you can apply it to anything really, and just critique them from that perspective, and also from the perspective that actually forms of oppression exist in the social body, in our relationships with our parents, with our family, with our friends, with our work colleagues, with our schools, right? All the forms of oppression, most of the forms of oppression we experience in contemporary UK society, right, come from that. Now, like, there are exceptions. Julian Assange was imprisoned by the state 5 years solitary confinement, right? For him, during that 5 years, the biggest form of oppression in his life was the state, right? No doubt about it, right? And so I'm not like being black and white, but in contemporary UK society, for most people, the biggest forms of oppression are their parents or their work colleagues or friends, where they get bullied, or school relations, or so where they get bullied, where they get picked on, where they get, you know, so on and so forth. Right? Even within anarchist subcultures, right, the biggest forms of oppression within sort of anarchist subcultures tend to be not the state, but other people. There's loads of domination within anarchist subcultures, you know. People gravitate to anarchy for all kinds of reasons, right? And often, like, actually being committed to the cause is not the dominant reason, you know. People might want a social life, right? And they see anarchists as a way to get a social life. People might want to dominate people, but they can't compete with the dominators in the wider culture, so they go to subcultures, right? Where the most extreme dominating people are kept at bay, like anarchist subcultures. That way they can have their little empire, you know. People have all kinds of reasons for gravitating to anarchist spaces, right? And so you can often find all of the forms of domination that you get in wider society mirrored in anarchist subcultures, but less extreme, you know. Okay, so there's my definition of anarchy, a society in which oppression is minimised, and therefore the anarchist praxis becomes about freeing people from oppression, right? However you choose to do that. You might go up against corporations and see them as the fundamental form of oppression, and so by going up against corporations, you're helping to free people from oppression, right? So that's your anarchist praxis, okay? And then what I'm saying is, okay, if you're looking to free people from oppression, it's important to identify where the oppression is coming from. And I'm saying the biggest forms of oppression that people experience are in the social body, right? That's exactly what feminism says, right? Feminism says, hey, we as women are oppressed. And the tool of oppression isn't the state, it isn't capitalism, it's bloody people, families, you know, it's the whole social body that enacts these oppressive ways against women, right? And similarly, it's the same with capitalism. Capitalism isn't a product of the rich, right? Everybody embodies it. Everybody acts it out. The rich are particularly good at it, and they maintain a stranglehold on the system of production, right? So that it can benefit them. But everybody else is doing it. Everybody else kind of mirrors those attitudes, you know. So I'm saying that the forms of oppression are within the social body, but actually dealing with forms of oppression in the social body is totally absent in anarchist praxis, right? Where is that? Because anarcho-syndicalism just says, well, let's deal with the state and the bosses, right? Well, what about the social relations among the bloody workers? That's where most of the oppression takes place, right? What, you think working class culture is free of oppression? You're crazy, right? I've lived among the working class all my life, right? It's a horrifically oppressive culture, man. You know, you go out there, you walk out this freaking door onto the street out there, and you see people will fucking have a go at you straight away, man. Just they don't like the fucking look of you, or just because they're in a bad fucking mood, right? And they want to take out on you. And it's not the fucking bosses that put them in a bad mood. It's the wife or the neighbour or their parents, or that have been oppressing them and they're taking it out on someone. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, if you ask them why are you in a bad mood, they're going to say, oh, it's a state. They're like, no, so and so stole this, or so and so did this to me, or my boyfriend dominates and abuses me, or this, that, and the other, right? The real forms of oppression in people's lives are other people, not abstract bloody forces, you know. And I feel that that's an immature form of anarchy that abstracts things, right? It's because what that means, when you abstract it all, is you don't actually have to confront the abusers in your life. You can conveniently just sweep that under the carpet and pretend that the problem is the state or capitalism. My friend who did a direct action with in Scotland on coal mines, right, has conveniently ignored the oppression she experiences from her parents and said the problem is the corporations and the state and I'm going to go up against them, right? Actually, the biggest forms of oppression that she's frightened of is her parents. So a more mature form of anarchy, if she was to progress to a more mature form of anarchy, she would start dealing with the real oppression in her life, which is her parents, right? Social oppression, by and large, right? But not always. Like I say, in extreme forms of dictatorship, then the problem is that actually the state, and you do need to do something. But I think in contemporary life, in the UK, which is the society I'm brought up in and the one I know, is the only one I can talk about, the fundamental forms of oppression are social body, within the social body and our social relations. So let me look at syndicalism, right? Let me critique syndicalism, okay? Because it sounds like a great idea, right? And like if you don't know, let me give a rough breakdown of syndicalism. Well, syndicalism would basically say something like, we organise the workers to take over the factories, right? And they run workers' councils, and in the various factories each appoint reps, and you have councils and then other councils, and eventually you have a council at the top that runs the country, right? Based upon this kind of democratic system. Sounds good in theory, right? So, oh, that sounds interesting. That seems kind of fair, right? Except for some small little things that are swept under the carpet, such as, well, what is the culture like among the workers, right? Because syndicalism says, well, the problem is the bosses. They're the ones that are authoritarian and ruling over us. Therefore, if we get rid of them, everything's going to be fine. But hold on. Like, are you saying then that relations among the workers themselves are not dominating and authoritarian? Because that's not my experience, right? The relationship among the workers is just as dominating as the relationship between the boss and the workers, right? Like, so like you get rid of the bosses and you allow you give workers the power. Well, if the working culture of the workers is based around relationships of domination and exploitation, you give them power. What sort of society are they going to create? It's going to create a similar society in which domination exists, right? I mean that's kind of what happens, right? Look at the various communist and socialist revolutions that have taken place, where they're supposed to be empowering the workers, yet all that happens is more extreme forms of domination take place, because the culture of the workers is just as bad as the culture of the bloody bosses. Nobody's actually stopped to say, why don't we deal with the culture of domination relationships among the workers and not the bosses? Why don't we actually deal with that first? Right? Instead of blaming it on the bosses, right? Instead of my friend blaming everything on the corporations and the government, why don't she actually deal with the form of domination from her parents, right? Well, the reason is because that becomes fucking real then. You have to actually deal with the frightening oppressors in your life, right? So the first thing I would critique about syndicalism is it kind of conveniently ignores the culture among the workers and assumes that the cultures among the workers is really anarchist and egalitarian, right? I'm not aware, I don't know what the culture among the workers was, you know, in 1930s Spain. I don't know, right? But I know today that's not the case. They're really exploitative, dominate, and toxic, can be really toxic, right? And I can't speak for all working class cultures, right? But certainly my experience of the working class is they're far from being a utopian class, right? There's this notion in syndicalism that somehow the working class are the victims and the rich are the guilty ones. Whereas actually I might turn around and say, hold on, but surely you could equally argue that the rich are just, that everyone is capitalist, but the rich are just particularly good at it. And if the working class get the chance to become rich, they'll bloody take it and oppress other people, right? They have the same attitudes and behaviours as the rich, in other words. So just taking the working class and putting them in power is just going to recreate a similar system of domination, exploitation, oppression. Because you've not actually dealt with oppression. You've dealt with the bosses, but the bosses aren't the source of oppression in the world, right? The source of oppression is social relations. You've not dealt with the social relations among the workers, for example, right? And how much of a focus is that in activism, you know, in syndicalism or in trade unionism? How much is a focus is on the actual workers and working class culture, you know? Other things I would critique about syndicalism is like, well, why should workers run the factories? Like what? I mean, I've done some managing in my time as a sort of freelance environmental project manager, right? I've put projects together, and then I've sought to get other people involved to take over and pay them a bit, right? And I've got to be very choosy. If I've got running a project and I want someone to manage part of it, I'm going to be really choosy about who that is, because managing is a real skill, right? Unless you've managed before, you don't really realise that it's a particular skill that most people do not have, right? So the idea that anyone can run factories or organise or manage is just not true, right? Any more than anyone can be a footballer for Man United, right? or anyone can be a top-rate physicist or a brain surgeon or a mother, you know what I mean, or a good mother, you know. They're skills that not everybody has, right? And so this idea that the workers can just generally run the factories and that the workers will pick the best among them to run the factories, I don't think is true. I'd like, you know, at the very least, I'm going to question that. I'm going to question the idea that the workers should run the factories and say, well, maybe it's actually beneficial to have a specific managerial class, people who are actually good at managing things, managing the factories, right? And maybe what you actually want is just a more democratic system so that the people manage it are not bloody tyrants, right, with power over the workers, but they're actually more democratic. That's what most workers seem to want. Most of the workers, when they're questioned out there, from what I've seen, aren't asking to run the factories. They're asking for more rights, right? They're asking for more democratic representation. They're asking for more secure jobs, of safer workplaces. They're not saying, oh, I want to run the factory. It's like, no. They're not asking to run the factories collectively, right? I think most workers recognise that managing is a particular skill that not everyone has, right? And for sure there is a class element to managing that needs to go, right? We live in a society in which certain people have access to privileged forms of education. They tend to become the managers, and so there is a class element in today's world to management that still exists, and that needs to go, right? You know, like, do you know what I mean? Like that's because that's a system of privilege and form of oppression. But generically saying that the workers should run the factories, I question that. I don't know. I think there's some value in having a managerial class. As someone that's done a lot of managing and organising in my life, I recognise it's a skill that few people possess, right? Unless you're really good at managing and organising, you don't necessarily realise that. It's like not everyone possesses that, right? That skill. And why should workers run the country? But why is having the workers form councils that run the country going to result in a society free of oppression? Like, I don't get that. Can someone explain that to me? How? Because like, if the culture of the working class is not a culture free of oppression, you take that culture and you stick it at the top and you have it run the country, how is it possibly going to result in a culture free of oppression when the culture of the working class, the workers themselves, is not free of oppression? Right? The culture of the working class has all the forms of oppression in it that every other class has. Right? Is it the case that the working class and the relations between the working class are benign and utopian compared to the middle class or the upper class? The answer is no. Right? They're all oppressive. They're all dominate. They're all exploit. And they're all abuse. Right? It's not a particularly utopian anarchist society. The working class. Right? This idea that somehow the working class aren't capitalist is wrong. The working class are just as capitalist as the bloody rich. No different, right? They're just not as good as it. They're at the bottom end of the capitalist system, but they're still capitalists, right? In terms of financial, they're at the financial power, they're at the bottom end. In terms of productive power, they're at the bottom end, right? But they're still capitalists. Doesn't mean they're not capitalists, right? So having the workers run the country, I'm not sure. And again, just like having the workers run the factories, I think running a country is a skill that not everybody has, right? Like, it's important to recognise that. Like, oh, let's have the workers doing all the driving in Formula One cars. But hold on, driving a Formula One car is not a skill that everybody bloody has. Let's leave that to the really badass Formula One drivers, right? So similarly, and I'm not saying our contemporary politicians are the best people to run a country. They're not, right? They're inept. They're really inept. But I'm saying replacing them with workers, I don't necessarily think is going to make for a better world. Right? Let's actually have the people who are good at governing run the country, right? Like, I don't know how that happens. I don't know how that happens. I'm just critiquing syndicalism, right? I don't have the answer because for me, anarchy is an emergent phenomenon, right? I don't know what it's going to look like, but I know how to get there, right? Despite not knowing what the final form looks like. And that's my theory of anarchy as an emergent phenomenon that I will explain. So all I'm doing is critiquing syndicalism. I'll present my own kind of solution to these problems later, right? So I would say, well, why should workers run the factories and why should they run the country? That doesn't strike me as a way to create a society free of oppression if the culture among the working class is itself oppressive, right? It's just as oppressive as the culture among the middle class and among the rich, right? I don't see it as any better or worse, right? So I don't see how that's going to result in a solution. It might result in a society that is has less oppression in it, right? It actually might be a step towards a more anarchic society, but history suggests otherwise, because all the revolutionary kind of movements of the past, I can't say all of them, but a lot of them seem to have gone really badly wrong. The whole kind of theory that getting the workers to run the country and collectivising the factories, don't know that that's worked out very well, right? Maybe Cuba is an example where it seems to be okay, right? And people will say, oh, well, that's state capitalism, though. That's state socialism, you know. We've not seen grassroots socialism. Yes, that's true, right? But maybe there's a reason for that, right? Because all those socialist movements started out as grassroots and then they were taken over. So maybe the problem is that those forms of socialism or those forms of anarchy are actually authoritarian. They mask authoritarian goals, right? So as the movements become more powerful, the authoritarian forces take over, right? And that is what I'm arguing. That actually that is the case, right? Yeah, so and like syndicalism, like ignores the role of culture, right? Puts the workplace as the fundamental place where oppression takes place. First of all, it's like, well, feminists would argue otherwise, right? And I'm arguing otherwise. I say no, oppression can take place in the workplace, and often when it takes place in the workplace, it's caused by other colleagues, not by managers. You know what I mean? So the idea in syndicalism that you've got to get rid of the bosses, like, hold on, no. What about dealing with the other workers, right? And I'm also arguing that actually the fundamental problem is in the social body. That's where oppression takes place. And so and syndicalism ignores the role of culture, right? How important culture is, right? you don't have to get rid of a hierarchy. Like, hierarchy in and of itself is not the problem, right? The problem is domination. Okay, you can have a hierarchy without domination. Now, people who want to dominate others utilize hierarchies to do so, but it doesn't follow that therefore hierarchies are bad, right? Like, any more than it follows that because people who rape women have a penis, that a penis is bad. It's like, no, it's just an, you know what I mean? It's like, it's the person that uses the thing for bad ends that's the problem. Similarly here, hierarchies are not the problem. It's people who seek to dominate that are the problem, and they will use hierarchies to dominate. But it doesn't mean hierarchies are bad. So an example is the Spanish Civil War, right? All the international brigades that came to the aid of the Spanish Republic volunteered. They volunteered, and they volunteered to become part of a hierarchy, right? But that hierarchy wasn't, as far as I'm aware, the hierarchy wasn't a hierarchy of domination, right? They could leave when they want, but they volunteered to join up, and they knew, well, they were joining up to form an army, therefore we need a hierarchy to organise effectively against another army, right? Because without a hierarchy, you're not going to be as effective. But they weren't dominated, whereas in the First World War in the UK, people were forcibly conscripted. And if they refused, they were put in prison 5-10 years, right? And if they're at the front and they decided they had enough and they walked away, they'd be shot. Right, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of soldiers were shot dead for desertion. Executed. That's domination, right? That's a hierarchy in which people are dominated. They're forced, and if you don't do what you're told, you're shot. Whereas in the Spanish Civil War, as far as I'm aware, I may be wrong, but people who joined the international brigades volunteered, and so they volunteered to become part of a hierarchy, but they could walk away at any time without being freaking shot, right? I mean, that's the difference between, and I don't know if that's totally true or not, right? I'm not an expert in the Spanish Civil War, but that's the gist that I've got. But even if it's not totally true, well, that's an example of a system where you have a hierarchy but not domination, right? People volunteer to become part of a hierarchy. They can walk away at any time, but as long as they've volunteered, they've agreed to become part of a hierarchy because they know that's an effective way of organising. That's a hierarchy without domination, right? Whereas in the First World War in the UK, the army organised hierarchically, but it dominated. It forced people into its ranks, and it shot them if they tried to leave. That's domination, okay? So there's a big difference between domination and hierarchy, and I don't think syndicalism takes that on board. I think syndicalism and a lot of anarchist forms like anti-statism just immediately tries to get rid of hierarchy, like consensus organising immediately tries to get rid of hierarchy, and it's like, I don't think that's helpful, right? Because hierarchies are really useful for organising. What we need to get rid of is oppression. Domination is a form of oppression. People who dominate do tend to use hierarchies, but that doesn't make hierarchies bad. That means if we're going to have hierarchies, we need to ensure that people who dominate are kept out of those hierarchies. That's what we need, and we need tools and means to be able to achieve that, to be able to identify and spot people who dominate and exploit, right? Rather than just trying to get rid of hierarchy altogether. So that's a bit of my critique of syndicalism. And like, if you look at AFED, which is I can't remember what's called, Anarchist Federation in the UK. It's a small organisation, but it's one of the sort of few working class anarchist organisations that we've got, right? And they have pamphlets on there. They've got a pamphlet on work, like critiquing work. They've got a pamphlet on sort of on climate change and the climate emergency, or the ecocide emergency, explaining why capitalism is a problem, right? And like, okay, so what's the problem for this sort of? And AFED is a sort of syndicalist, anarcho-syndicalist organisation. What's their problem with capitalism? Well, their problem is that capitalism is exploitative. It exploits us. But it's like, hold on, but capitalism doesn't have to inherently exploit anyone. If your problem is with exploitation, then that's not a problem with capitalism. You can argue within the current system for a citizen's income of £1,500 a month, right? And then nobody has to work. So all you don't need to have a revolution that overthrow the government, institute workers' councils, blah blah blah. Just fight for citizens' income, and therefore nobody's exploited. Everyone gets an income of £1,500 a month. You don't have to work, and if you want to work, you can. It's your choice. But otherwise, you can just chill out with a £1,500 income, right? You've got loads of people and groups in society who will join you for that fight. You may actually win it, right? And thereby you solve the problem of exploitation. So like, the idea that capitalism is inherently exploitative is wrong, right? So let me move on from syndicalism. Well, I've questioned syndicalism to questioning anti-capitalism, right? Which is another fundamental sort of tenet of anarchist practice today. To the point where if you turn up to an anarchist group and you say, I'm not anti-capitalist, they'll fling you out the fucking door, right? They'll laugh in your face. You'll be ridiculed, right? It's so ingrained within anarchist subculture today that you must be anti-capitalist that nothing else is ever considered. It's like, so hold on a minute. Are you sure? Are you sure that developing? So here's the thing, right? Are you sure that in order to develop a society free of oppression, we have to get rid of capitalism? You sure? Because like I haven't heard a very good reason for that. So let me critique it, right? So I came up with AFED, the Anarchist Federation, and their critiques on the work pamphlet and on their pamphlets addressing the environmental crisis are that, well, capitalism is inherently exploitative. I was like, no, that's not the case. Capitalism is not inherently exploitative. If your only gripe is you're being exploited, then fight for a citizen's income which is comfortable enough for you to live on comfortably and do your thing, right? £1,500 a month, right? I'm just picking that figure out there. Fight for a citizen's income. Then you don't have to change anything else. You don't have to get rid of global capitalism. You don't have to get rid of the state. You don't do anything else. Just fight for a citizen's income. You'll get loads of other organisations willing to help you, right? But if you go out there and say, I want a revolution to get rid of the state and capitalism, no one's going to join you in that struggle, right? Very few people. But if you go out there and say, hey, I'm tired of being exploited, let's have a fucking citizen's income so we have a choice about whether we want to work or not. How about that, right? So I've just got an alert on my computer. I'm low on disk space. Oh. I'm sure I can live with that. So like being exploited is not something that's inherent with capitalism, right? You can have capitalism with a citizen's income, which guarantees people have a choice about whether they want to work or not. Oh, well, I want to earn more than £1,500, so I'm going to have a look at some of the jobs out there, right? I'm earning £1,500. Who's going to go and clean the fucking toilets in Tesco's now? Right, no one, right? So the highest paid jobs out there are going to be the shittiest ones. Because in order to get people to clean the streets or clean the jobs clean the toilets at Tesco's, they're going to have to pay people big money. Like if Tesco's are offering me £100 an hour to clean their toilets, yeah, I might think about it, right? They're going to give me fucking £10 an hour. Get lost. I clean your freaking toilets. I'm going to take my £1,500 citizen's income. I'm going to chill here. I don't care about your toilets, right? But the minute you deprive people of an income, they got no other fucking choice other than to take shitty pay doing shitty jobs, right? That's exploitation. You give them a citizen's income, they have a choice. To hell with your shitty jobs. I ain't doing it, right? I've got my citizen's income. You want people to clean fucking toilets, you pay them big time, right? Suddenly the shitty jobs get really well paid and people have a choice over whether it gets done, right? They're like, okay, I'm on £1,500, I want to save up for a holiday, I might go and take £100 an hour, clean the toilets at Tesco's for a bit, right? I mean, you know, I put up with the smell and everything else and the nastiness. £100 an hour? Yeah, you know. Suddenly you're not exploited, right? You can make a free choice and weigh the pros and cons, you see. So I don't agree that capitalism is inherently exploitative. No, it doesn't have to be. And the other thing that AFED say, and this is an anarchist organisation saying this, right? So I'm picking the what anarchist organisations are saying about capitalism, why they're against it. They say, oh, it's exploitative. Oh, no, it's not exploitative. It doesn't have to be, right? Capitalism is inherently bad for the environment. They argue this in their leaflet to environmentalists. Like, that's not true, right? It ignores culture, right? If you plant capitalism in a culture that is abusive to the environment, then the form of capitalism you get will be abusive to the environment, right? It's not true that just because you have private ownership of the means of production, that's inherently going to be exploitive to the environment. How does that follow? It doesn't follow at all, right? if the culture is inherently exploitative to the environment, then the form of capitalism that arises is going to be mirror that, right? If the culture is holds the environment to be sacred, then no type of capitalism that is planted within that culture is going to break that, right? Because the minute a corporation starts to abuse the environment, everyone's going to kick off. Who the hell do you mean, right? But if nobody cares about the environment, or people just legitimize exploiting the environment, then the capitalism that flourishes is going to be one that exploits the environment. So I don't agree with these grand statements, these grand critiques that say, oh, capitalism is fundamentally exploitative, or capitalism is fundamentally exploitative of the environment, or exploitative of people. It's like, no, our culture, the culture that we live in, is exploitative of people and exploitative of the environment. And that's mirrored in the forms of economic organising that have manifested from it, such as the specific form of capitalism. But you can't generalise that to capitalism itself. You can't generalise it and say, therefore, any system of economic organisation that has private ownership of the means of production is therefore exploitative and therefore abusive to the environment. That doesn't follow, right? And the other thing I would say about anti-capitalism is, like, I kind of feel that economic freedom is fundamental to a society free of oppression, right? I'm suspicious of people who decide, oh, anarchy must be anti-capitalist. Right? They're forcing that on everyone else. You go into an anarchist space and say, can we talk about some of the benefits of capitalism? Yeah, you'd have to be brave to go into an anarchist space like that, because it's so authoritarian, right? It's so authoritarian. They would throw you out, they condemn you, blah, blah, blah. There's like, you can go to university in liberal capitalist society and you can talk about anything. You can talk about anarchy, you can talk about lesbianism, you can talk about gender, you can talk about anything you want, right? You go into an anarchist subculture, a fucking different matter altogether. You have to be real careful what you fucking say. You say anything that fucking benefits, that bigs up capitalism, you'll be condemned and chucked out, man. You'll be hanged. If you say anything that doesn't agree with the standard fucking diatribe on gender, you'll be fucking hung outside on a lamppost, right? That's how extreme shit is in anarchist subculture. That's not a culture free of oppression. That's a really oppressive culture that's heavily fucking policed. You have to really control what you got to say, right? As compared to liberal capitalism, where you're free to talk about what you want, right? Any kind of politics, any kind of this, that and the other, you're free. So liberal capitalism, in a lot of ways, is a lot more anarchist than the anarchist subcultures that exist in contemporary UK society, right? So who the hell are they to criticise capitalism when they themselves are creating oppressive spaces that are more oppressive in many ways than the spaces that liberal capitalism creates, right? And economic freedom, the ability, like, are we really saying that, oh, I want to create a little, or I want to work with the organic farms in my neighbourhood, right? I want to get food, and I'm going to go to the town and I'm going to sell it to people, and actually, yeah, that's my business, and hey, do you want to help me out and I'll pay you, right? I have an employee. The anarchists will tell us, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're owning your own means of production and you've privatised it, therefore you're going to fucking, no, shut you down. Really? Right? Because to me that's a fundamental form of economic liberty, and most people don't think they're exploited just because they work for somebody else. That's ridiculous, right? Only fucking ideological communists and anarchists think that, right? Most normal people do not think they're exploited just because they're working for somebody else, right? So like, there to me there is a fundamental economic freedom that you must protect. And the minute you say, oh, we're anti-capitalism, you've become authoritarian. You've created a fucking culture which is authoritarian and oppressive, right? What about the people who want to start their own business and employ others? You're going to fucking shut them down. Is that really what you're going to do? Is that really the culture that you think is free of oppression? That seems like a crazy culture. I do not want to live in that culture, right? So I'm extolling some of the benefits of capitalism. One, we have economic freedom and we have political freedom, which the anarchists do not fucking give us, right? So like, and I say the anarchists, I mean like the typical anarchist subcultures in the UK, right? That claim to be anarchists, right? They do not give us our economic freedom, and they don't give us our political freedom either, right? They shut down those conversations and say, you must be anti-capitalist, you must be this, you must be that. It's like, whatever. That's not a society free of oppression, right? I want to create a space where people can actually discuss things, right? I think you must protect people's right to start their own business and to employ others. That is fundamentally what most people will consider freedom. I want to start a job. I want to start a little business of my own. I'm going to employ a couple of people, give them a decent wage. Right? That's a freedom. You've got to protect that. In my anarchist kind of world, you protect that. And anyone that wants to shut people down doing that is not anarchy in my view, right? So I'm dubious about anti-capitalism, right? And the other thing is like market forces, right? How are we going to determine production? Well, are the anarcho-syndicalists really going to say, we'll have workers' councils deciding what production, how many cauliflowers we're going to meet, how many batteries we're going to produce? It's like, really? Come on, man, you serious? That does not strike me as a. I don't want fucking anarchist councillors telling me how many cauliflowers I'm allowed to fucking eat or how many cauliflowers I'm allowed to produce, right? So go away out of my life, right? As a grower, I'll fucking decide that based upon what my customers want, right? That's market forces, right? Oh God. But if you're anti-capitalist, suddenly you're not allowed to allow market forces to determine production. Why not? It's fundamentally democratic and anarchist, right? It only becomes centralised and authoritarian when you allow the markets to be dominated by billionaire class or by merchant banks or by big private investment firms, right? Then the democracy in the marketplace is trashed and you can no longer trust markets, right? But you don't throw the baby out the bathwater. Fundamentally, markets are democratic, provided you keep the fucking sharks out of them, right? Shut down fucking Wall Street. Yeah, that's a good thing for anarchists to do. But don't fucking rail against markets and libertarian forms of capitalism that are democratic in nature, right? Because those are where our liberty lies, right? The marketplace is fundamentally democratic. How many cauliflowers do I produce? Well, how many cauliflowers do people want? Right? I go every week to the market selling my cauliflowers. I know roughly how many they want. I don't need fucking anarchist councils telling me shit. That's my business, right? I run the business. I'll let the market determine how many cauliflowers I produce. Leave it like that, right? Let the market determine it. But make sure that the marketplace is free of domination, right? I don't allow powerful organisations to dominate markets. Keep them democratic, right? So like I said, for example, well, I want to preserve capitalism because the ability to start your own business is a fundamental economic freedom that I don't think should be messed with. The minute you stop people's ability to start their own business and employ others on a fair basis, you become an oppressive force. And you start to become an oppressive society. It's like, no. One of the benefits of capitalism is free to start our own businesses, right? That's great. You know, I mean, like within a certain degree, like not all of us have access to funds, right? So we can't. It's not actually like that. But I'm just talking about a pure form of capitalism, not the existing system, right? But obviously, right, let's imagine I start my own business and start getting really successful. And in 10 years later, I've got this huge global multinational corporation that owns half the fucking land in the country, right? Clearly, there is a point at which it becomes, no, that's a danger to society now, right? That's no longer an economic freedom preserved. Now you've got an oppressive force in society that's a power in and of itself that can oppress the rest of society. It's like, that's got to be stopped, right? So the whole sort of anti-globalist, anti-corporate thing, I'm down with, right? It's like, yeah, these powerful institutions that are basically authoritarian in nature, they're not democratically accountable to the rest of us, and they actually exert huge force on society and control society. Yeah, we've got to take those out, right? Those are forms of capitalism that are toxic. But let's just not be blanket anti-capitalism or anti-state or anti-this, that, and the other. It just seems silly to me because the world is more complex than that, right? And it's like, you know, there's so many different forms of capitalism, right? Like a lot of green environmentalists will say, oh, well, capitalism deals with growth, right? And it's the growing economy that's consuming the earth, therefore we've got to abandon capitalism. But no, that's not true, right? Like growth is caused, I think, as far as I'm aware, growth is caused by the banking system, right? And the fractional reserve banking system that inflates the money supply, and so you constantly have to grow the economy, right? To consume all this money and stop collapses and stuff like that. I don't fully understand it, but as far as I'm aware, that's what causes growth. You can have forms of capitalism that don't have fractional reserve banking systems, or that don't have usury and forms of lending with interest, right? That's what causes growth, right? So there are loads of different tweaks on capitalism, you know, like citizens' incomes, changing the banking system, and what do actually workers want? Actually, they're not calling to be running the bloody workplaces or to be running the country. They're calling for like more democracy in the workplace. They're calling for more secure rights, for safer workplaces, for more holidays or better pay, right? Those are the things they want, right? They're not actually calling. So why are we trying to? Why, as anarchists, surely we've got to listen to the workers, right? Not just force fucking ideologies down their throats and say, oh, you lot must run their factories and then run the country as well. I don't think they want to. So it just seems silly. Those forms of anarchy seem silly to me, you know. And like it strikes me that anti-capitalism is also rooted in this idea that we must have equality of wealth. It's like, man, you know, that whole equality agenda I'm not into, right? Why do people think we must have equality of wealth, right? What equality do we have in any sphere of human activity? Do we have, is everyone as good looking as everyone else, right? Has everyone got as fit a body as everyone else? Is everyone as intelligent as everyone else? And does everyone have as many sexual partners as everyone else? Is everyone as good at swimming as everyone else? Is everyone as good at weightlifting as everybody else? You know, we have inequality in every sphere of human activity. Why shouldn't it be any different in wealth? What's the problem with having inequalities in wealth? What's the problem with having some people rich and some people not rich, right? The problem is having people poor and people oppressed and impoverished, right? It's not, the problem isn't inequalities in wealth. The problem is people who are lacking, right? That's, for me, what you've got to focus on. And the idea that by getting rid of inequalities in wealth, you therefore get rid of people going without, that doesn't follow at all. Sorry, I've not seen any kind of logical sequence where you get rid of inequalities of wealth and suddenly all the impoverishment in society goes away. I don't think so. So like I'm not really down with the equality agenda, right? You don't have equality in any sphere of human activity at all, right? So I don't know why you'd expect financial equality. You're quite happy if some people are really good at making money, let them make money if that's what they want to do with their lives, right? That's a freedom, right? As long as they're not oppressing anyone or exploiting anyone, I'd protect their right to do that. That's a fundamental freedom. Otherwise, you're oppressing them. You're just making out that what they're doing is evil. Well, then why is it evil? Right? If they're exploiting someone or they're stealing somebody else's wealth in order to make themselves wealthy, yes, that's a problem. And that's a lot of what contemporary capitalism is, right? It impoverishes others and steals the wealth and land and resources from them. Those forms of capitalism are toxic, for sure. We need to fight those. But that doesn't mean capitalism itself is toxic, right? So I taking that definition, yeah, and I feel like fundamentally anti-capitalism is fueled by jealousy of the rich, right? There's no real, for those reasons. So taking that definition of anarchy as trying to create a society in which oppression is minimised, right? I quibble over whether syndicalism and anti-capitalism are anarchist, right? It may be that adopting syndicalism or anti-capitalism might lead to a society that's less oppressive than our existing system, but I wouldn't describe that as anarchy, right? And even that is dubious, because it seems to me that behind syndicalism and behind capitalism are grabs for power, which is an authoritarian urge to dominate and force your agenda on others, right? If you have an authoritarian urge to dominate and force your agenda on others, what are you going to focus on? Well, you're going to focus on power and trying to grab power, because that's how you force your will upon others, right? So these forms of anarchy that focus their attention on grabbing power, I'm very dubious about. Seems to me that they're masking an authoritarian urge to dominate others, right? That's why they're so fucking attracted to power in the first place. And I'm not the only one to think that, right? here's a little anarchist pamphlet I got from an anarchist book fair in London a couple of years ago, right? Means and Ends by Zoe Baker, and I think this is a critique of seizing state power, right? This is a critique. It's called Means and Ends. It's a critique of seizing state power, right? And it's called Means and Ends because, like, the means we use to achieve an anarchist society are mirrored in the ends. Like, if we use violent or dominating means to try and achieve an anarchist society, what we're going to end up with is a violent and dominating culture, because that's the means we've used. So if those are the means we're using, why are we going to expect the final goal to be any different, right? And I think it's based on a critique of seizing state power that goes way back to anarchist thinkers like Malatesta, who is an Italian anarchist in the first part of the 20th century. And I think this critique is based upon his writings, right? I'll just give you a little quote from it, right? In order to achieve a communist society, the majority of the population has to engage in activities during the struggle against capitalism itself that transform them into people who want to and are able to self-direct their lives and their community through local councils and federations of councils. If this does not happen, then communism will not be created. This is because for communism to exist, real people must establish and reproduce it day after day through their own activity, right? In other words, if you have a culture that is not anarchist and you seize state power, you're going to create a fucking society that is not anarchist, that just mirrors the culture that seized power, right? Actually, for a genuine anarchist society, people have to live it and breathe it every day, right? You have to live it and breathe it every day, right? As much as you're able to, right? Obviously, if you're in prison, you're limited in what you can do, right? And we're all imprisoned to some degree. We're all kind of imprisoned by this society in some degree. I'm stuck in social housing on benefits, right? In a place I don't want to live, with limited options in life, right? That's a prison. I have no doubt about that. I am in prison as a result of being marginalised by this culture, right? But within that, I have some degree that I can exercise. I can stand up to authoritarians. I can join movements. I can help others to overcome oppression. You know, and I can organise with others. I have some freedom within that. You know, even in prison, you have some freedom. I've been in prisons, right? I spent years in prisons in this country as well. Even within prisons, you have some freedom, but it's bloody restricted, right? You know what I mean? It's restricted to what you might be able to think about. Well, I can choose what I'm going to think about, at least. I'll think anarchisty thoughts and not thoughts of domination. That's something, right? It's still got some freedom, but anyway. So what she's arguing there is that the fundamental praxis should be our social relations, right? Because it's our social relations that reproduce the system, right? And if we want to create an anarchist society, we have to be careful about the means we use, right? We can't use means of domination or violence. And I'm respectful of the whole diversity of tactics thing, right? But ultimately, if we and like, you know, I should be careful. I'm not anti-violence, right? It's the intention that you wield the thing with. So what I'm really arguing about is not the tool, right? It's the intention. It's the means to the ends, right? It's what is your intention? If you're going to use violence, well, what's the intention? Is it to hurt and get revenge on people, or is it just a recognition that, hey, they've got fucking guns and they're killing people and we've got to stop them, and the only way we can stop them is to use violence, right? That's a good intention, you see. So the means is a good one. But if it's like, those bastards have done this to me, I want to get them fucking back, right? Then that's not a good intention, right? So I'm not anti-violence. It's the means that you're using, the intention that you're using to achieve the anarchist society. And what she's arguing there is basically saying, hey, it's anarchy ultimately is reproduced by our social relations, right? It's the social body. So that's where we've got to work. That's my problem with syndicalism. Like, what are you actually doing to address the culture within the workers? If you're not doing anything to address the culture within the workers and you're just focused on the bosses, saying, we'll just get rid of the bosses and everything's going to be fine, that's madness. Because the culture of the workers is one of where they repress and dominate each other, or one in which they repress and dominate women, or one in which they exploit the environment to get the goods for their factories made. You're just going to reproduce the same system. The only difference is it's going to be better for the workers. Not going to be better for the women. It's not going to be better for the environment. It's not going to be better for the bosses or the political class. All going to get their heads chopped off, right? But it might be better for some of the workers. And even then, it's dubious because most of the socialist systems out there haven't gone out too well for the workers, right? They've been pretty screwed over by that as well. Again, I come down to really the fundamental anarchist praxis for me is liberating people from oppression. And so I want to come on then in this final part of the talk to talk about anarchy as an emergent phenomenon. I want to present a different model of anarchy, right? And it's not one that starts with me, right? The emergent theory is common within social science and within environmentalism, right? So let me give you an example, right? The goal of anarchy is to create a society free of oppression. Okay, so your anarchist praxis becomes about freeing people from oppression. Anyone, doesn't matter who it is, right? And the minute the number of people who are living out lives free of oppression reaches a critical mass, anarchist society emerges. Right? That's what Zoe's saying there. It's like, hey, people have got to reproduce anarchist society day by day, and when that reaches a critical mass, it happens, right? And that's the emergent theory, right? There's a critical mass, and poof, it just spreads through the population and it emerges. It seems magical, but it's not, right? I'm going to show you some graphs in a bit and see. So I'll just say it again. Like you recognise that anarchy is a society which minimises oppression, right? And if oppression can be got rid of altogether, then okay, anarchy is a society completely free of oppression. But at the very least, you minimise it, right? And that way, anarchy isn't a pipe dream, right? That's important, because when you turn around and say anarchy is a society without oppression, to most people that's a pipe dream. It's like, I don't think that's possible, right? But when you talk about anarchy as a society in which you minimise oppression, then it's achievable, right? Well, we can go from here to here, and this is a society that has less oppression. So therefore, that's anarchist praxis, right? And then we can go from here to there, and so on and so forth. So you're minimising oppression, right? And so the goal becomes then, okay, so I help to free people from oppression. Who? Well, that's your choice. But whoever you free from oppression, you're creating a more anarchist society, because suddenly there's at least one member in it who's less oppressed than they were before, and therefore you've helped to shift society towards a more anarchic system. And when the number of people living lives free of oppression, or freer of oppression, reaches a critical mass, the system spontaneously shifts, right? That's social science. So let me introduce you a graph that kind of shows the emergent theory in a bit more detail, right? Because it's not just me making it up, right? It is social science. So let me I have to tweak this software a little bit. Display capture. I'll just tweak the software so you can see my screen. Okay, and I'll keep my face up there. I just want to share with you a graph, right? So this is a graph from a paper that came out 2 or 3 years ago, right? You know what? I've forgotten what it's called. Here we go. I've got the paper here. I'll just read out the title in case anyone wants to find it, because you can find it online. It's called An Integrative Framework for Transformative Social Change, a Case in Global Wildlife Trade. So I'll say it again. An Integrative Framework for Transformative Social Change, a Case in Global Wildlife Trade. So it's basically a paper that presents an integrative framework for social change, right? And then it gives an example of it for the global wildlife trade. But you don't need to look at the example. It just summarises decades of social science research to bring it all together to present what it considers the best practices for achieving social change, right? And this is what you might call an emergent theory graph, right? You see, if you follow my mouse, you see here it says emergence of a new norm. So this is from sort of the environmental movement, from all the research done on the environmental movement, are trying to change people's behaviour towards more pro environmental practice. So you might, for example, be looking to get people to stop using plastic bags, right? And so what this shows is that there is a tipping point, right? There is a tipping point. You've got a tipping point here early on the curve, right? Of which, if you can get this many people stopping using the plastic bags, then there is basically a cascade reaction, and the behaviour sweeps through the rest of society, and you have a new norm that emerges, right? That's the emergent theory. Okay. In other words, emergent theory says you don't have to try and change everyone, right? You only have to get to a certain place, and then the change cascades through the rest of society, and you have a new norm emerging, right? What if that new norm is a society without domination, rather than a society that doesn't use plastic bags? What if the new norm you're trying to instill is a society free of oppression, right? You see that the same theory can be applied to anarchy, where anarchy becomes an emergent phenomenon. In other words, all you have to do is to get enough people to overcome oppression, and for that to reach a social tipping point, and it will cascade through society, right? You'll have what anarchists call a spontaneous revolution, right? It will just spontaneously emerge, right? But in this case, you're not organising against the state, you're not organising against capitalism, you're just freeing people from oppression, and you're helping to create a critical mass, and then the thing happens, right? Because the difference is, with anti-capitalism or anti-statism, you're prescribing beforehand what an anarchist society looks like, which is inherently authoritarian, right? It's like, hold on, anarchy is a society of people free of oppression. Who knows what that's going to look like, right? That's going to be the cumulative outcome of all those people living lives, like Zoe Baker said, right? It's the sum total of all those people living lives free of oppression. Who knows what that's going to look like? You cannot prescribe it. The minute you decide anarchy is anti-capitalist or anarchy is anti-statist, you have become a bloody oppressive force yourself, and you've ceased to become anarchist, because you're then going out there telling people what it must look like when you don't know. Right? You've just become a force of oppression in society, and now you're working against anarchy. And that's what I say anti-capitalism and syndicalism is, that actually anti-anarchic forces, because they're prescribing what an anarchist society looks like and then going out and enforcing on everyone, right? Whereas the emergent theory of anarchy says, hey, if we want a society free of oppression, then let's work to free people from oppression and allow those numbers to reach a social tipping point, in which case it will cascade, that change will cascade through the rest of society, right? Now you might be dubious about this. So let me explain this graph a little bit, right? At the bottom, if you follow my mouse, at the bottom of the screen, you've got these 5 categories, right? So whatever the new norm that you're trying to get society to shift to, right? So like in our case, our norm is a society free of oppression, is anarchy. We want our society to become anarchist, right? You'll have some innovators who start the process, right? They go out and they start trying to convince people, or in our case, you go out and you start trying to help people overcome oppression. Say, hey, look, you've got an oppressive mother and father, right? I want to help you overcome them. Hey, you've got an oppressive, bloody patriarchal partner. I want to help you overcome oppression. Hey, you've got a tyrannical boss. I want to help you overcome oppression. Hey, you're living in a tyrannical political system, right? I want to help you overcome those political forces, right? You're helping people overcome oppression, well, wherever it is. Doesn't matter whether they're rich. The beauty of it is, it doesn't matter whether they're rich. Doesn't matter whether they're white or black or male or female. Doesn't matter who they are, right? You're helping them overcome oppression, and so therefore you're creating a society that's more free of oppression. So that what you're essentially doing is trying to create a bigger and bigger pool of people who are living less oppressed lives, right? And when that reaches the critical mass, boom, then the thing just shifts through the entire population, right? So an example might be women no longer accepting patriarchal partners, right? that reaches a critical mass in society, bang, suddenly patriarchy is considered a social disease. It's considered unacceptable. It's an outrage. Whereas today it's legitimised, right? He wants to dominate me and control me, and he's jealous of everyone. That's considered normal, right? So we need to create new norms around relationships in which that kind of behaviour is considered toxic, right? So that's one example of how a new norm might sweep through society. We end up with a less oppressive society, right? So the number of people living lives free of oppression has increased. In this case, women, right? The number of women being oppressed by oppressive partners has lessened. So the number of people living lives free of oppression has increased, right? So you start out with the innovators, right? And the next group are the early adopters. They're these people who share values with the innovators, right? So if I'm an anarchist, I'm going out there trying to help people overcome oppression. Some of the early adopters might be women's groups, right? Who like recognise that they're under oppression from patriarchal men. Some of the early adopters might be workers who recognise they're being oppressed by the bosses, right? So the early adopters are the people who immediately think, we share these values and you can work with them, right? So those are the next group who adopt the new norm, right? And then you've got the early majority, right? These are people, and note where the social tipping point is, right? It's between the early adopters and the early majority, right? So the early adopters are people who share your values, right? And who you can immediately work with. The early majority, the early majority are people who are in the same social milieu as the early adopters. So they see them adopting this new behaviour and they interact with them and talk to them, and they therefore end up adopting it themselves. Somewhere in between there and there, you reach the social tipping point, right? The late majority, at which point the thing becomes a cascade through the rest of society, right? In other words, there's a kind of snowball effect where once you reach the tipping point, poof, it goes off on its own, right? The late majority are people who just tend to follow the herd, right? So they see all the innovators and early adopters and the early majority adopting this new behaviour, and they just follow the herd. Like suddenly baseball caps are in, therefore I'm going to get myself a baseball cap. That's me as a late majority just following the herd. Everybody loves the Beatles, therefore I'm going to listen to the Beatles because it's, do you know what I mean? It's like, that's just following the herd. Everybody's into overcoming oppression, and therefore I'm gonna be into that because that's the new cool, right? That's the late majority, right? Then you have the laggards, right? These are the diehards, right? These are the people who are not interested in this new behaviour, this new norm, and they will not change under any circumstances until the rest of society changes and forces them to. Either through societal pressure, through stigmatisation, or through legislative changes or tax changes or whatever, right? They only change when they're forced to. And you notice, right, with this emergent theory of anarchy, that you don't need to deal with the laggards, right? Look at what standard anarchist praxis does. It immediately takes the laggards, which are the bosses and the state, the most authoritarian, most extreme forms of authoritarianism, and attacks those, right? Whereas social science says, hey, don't do that. You're wasting your bloody time, right? Deal with the people who share your values, right? Don't worry about the diehards, right? They will shift when this new norm sweeps through society. So you focus on the people who are already invested in overcoming forms of oppression, like women's groups or like some of the workers and so on, right? But you don't just start to attack abstract forces or like the state or tyrannical bosses, right? Because those are the laggards. They're the people who are never going to change, right? There's no point trying to change the behaviour of someone who is who has gone through their life dominating women, right? They're not going to shift, but you could change the behaviour of the women who are being dominated to overcome that, right? And when the change sweeps through the rest of society, those people are forced to change, right? So that exposes kind of standard approaches to anarchy as being really faulty, right? The standard approaches to anarchy where you focus on the laggards, the capitalists, the bosses, the super rich, the tyrants, the dictators and the state. That's like, those are the laggards, right? They're never going to change. How many bosses have listened to anarchist practices and thought, oh yeah, you know what, I'm going to stop, right? They don't, right? So leave them be, focus on the early adopters and the early majority in your anarchist practice. That's what this social science is saying, and that's what I'm saying. It's an emergent form of anarchy, right? It's an emergent theory of anarchy where you say, hey, all we've got to do is create a critical mass of people living lives free of oppression, and anarchy will sweep through the population. Well, let me take this graph away. So I've looked at a definition of anarchy, right? As a society that minimises oppression. I've critiqued some of the standard forms of anarchy, like syndicalism and anti-capitalism and statism, anti-statism, and then I've introduced this emergent theory of anarchy, right? And then I've used a graph of social science of how changes sweep through society to illustrate how an emergent theory of capitalism works and how it focuses you on targeting systemic forms of oppression and helping people to overcome them, and B, focusing on people who share your values, not on the people who don't share your values, like the state or the bosses and so on and so forth, right? Those are the laggards, those are the extreme authoritarians who are never going to adopt an anarchist system because they're too privileged by the current system, so they're going to do everything they can to maintain the status quo, right? You've been wasting your time on them. You focus on the people who share your values, and it's there that the tipping point can reach, in which case the values cascade through society, right? So the approach of anarchists that say we must overcome the bosses of the state is the wrong one, because they do that, they overcome the bosses of the state, but what about the rest of the social body? Right? Those forms of domination are just reproduced again because they've not swept the changes haven't swept through the social body at all, right? And anyway, trying to deal with the laggards, the bosses, and the state leads to a bloody bloodbath, right? Leads to a bloodbath, whereas this doesn't. And this doesn't lead to the demonisation of anyone either, because you're just helping free people from oppression. Somebody might be rich and they're being oppressed by their parents. You help them overcome that, right? You don't say, oh, you're rich, therefore you're one of the oppressive classes, therefore I'm not going to help you. It's like, no. Your goal is to create a society free of oppression. So you work to help people overcome oppression regardless of who they are, right? So you're not demonising anyone either. So that whole kind of demonisation of people that you get within anarchist ideologies is taken out, right? And that's unpleasant, do you know what I mean? And the other thing you don't have a revolutionary ethos, right? You have an emergent ethos. In other words, you work on the people who share your values, and then on those within their social milieu, and in between there is the tipping point in which that new normal cascade through reaction. So that's the emergent theory, right? Whereas the revolutionary theory says, oh, we must focus on the centres of power, we topple them, and then everything's going to be fine, and we're going to live out happy lives in our anarchist society. It's like that. Who thought that up, right? Was it Marx? I don't know, but it doesn't strike me as tenable. And the social science there seems to suggest that it's not tenable, right? Because the extreme forms of domination are just reproduced by the social body, right? So like you get rid of that, you haven't dealt with it in the social body, right? And the other thing about revolutionary goals is like one of the most effective ways to destabilise a country and destroy it is to create a power vacuum. When you topple a government, you create a power vacuum, right? It's incredibly destabilising, chaotic. You don't really know what the hell is going to happen or what's going to emerge from that. But by and large, in my kind of like, from what I've seen, my limited study of history and contemporary sort of global politics, when you create a power vacuum, the most despotic elements of society rush to fill it, right? The existing power structure, no matter how dysfunctional it is, exists to hold the forces of society in check, right? You suddenly topple that, all of those forces that were currently held in check are suddenly unleashed. All the really despotic, even the more despotic forces and the most evil forces suddenly seize have an opportunity to seize power, they fucking go for it, right? What's the history of revolutions in the 20th century? Have they all worked out really well? Or have they all brought forth despotic regimes that are bloody worse than what came before? I mean, I'll leave you to answer that, right? But it seems to me that if you're going out there promoting revolutionary theory, that's not a very good anarchist praxis, because the history of revolutions doesn't seem to be particularly good, right? And toppling power creates power vacuums. How are you going to deal with the forces that are unleashed when power vacuums are created? That seems to be absent in revolutionary theory, right? People don't talk about it. People just seem to think, oh, well. I mean, people talk about it under the terms the counter-revolution. But counter-revolution, no, not quite. Because the counter-revolution is like, oh, it's whatever held the system in place, then opposing the revolutionary ethos. Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying there are even more worse forms out there that are held in check by the current system, and those are going to grab for power as well. So it's not just the counter-revolution. There are other forces in society that will mobilise for power, right? And I don't see that talked about too much in revolutionary theory. But I'm sure there are books out there written all about it, you know. But generally, power vacuums are bad things. So going for a revolution that topples power, it's going to destabilise, bring chaos, and who knows what's going to emerge from that. It's too much chaos, right? So this emergent theory is much better because it avoids that, and it just says, hey, work on the people that share your values and those within their milieu, and somewhere along that line there is a tipping point that is reached where that new normal spread through society, right? That's not just me fantasizing it, that's social science research on how behaviour change is created. We're trying to create a society free of behaviour, free of oppression. That's changing people's behaviours, okay? So we're seeking to create behaviour change. So we need to adopt the understanding of behaviour change science, of social science to do that, right? Let's look at it and see what it says, right? And it seems to suggest that the way behaviours change through society is based upon an emergent model, as I've shown there. And that paper was a few years ago, and it summarised a few decades of social science research. So that's the emergent theory of anarchy that I'm presenting to you, right? And I'm saying, hey, I think the existing forms of anarchist praxis, mask authoritarian urges to dominate others, right? Because they all focus on seizing power for themselves, which is suspicious if you're supposed to be trying to create a society free of domination. Why are you so obsessed with power, right? And grabbing power, you know. So I critique those, and I critique the sort of standard forms of anarchy, syndicalism, capitalism, and the revolutionary theories that say we take out power and everything's going to be fine, because they ignore social interactions and the importance of our day-to-day social interactions, and the fact that most of the oppression we experience in contemporary UK society comes from the social body and not the institutions, right, like the state or whatever, for most of us, right? If you're ethnic and in an inner city, then yeah, maybe the state is the biggest form of oppression in the form of the police, right? But for most people in UK society, it comes from the social, and even in that case of being in an ethnic community, you'll probably still find that it's family and people in your neighbourhood that are the biggest forms of oppression, right? So and I find that standard anarchist praxis totally ignores social relations. Like, how do we overcome authoritarianism and forms of domination within our social relations? Forget the bosses in the state. Focus on the social relations, right? How do we do that? And how can we help other people to do that? And if we do that, we'll create a pool of society, a pool of people in society who are free of oppression, and that creates the tipping point. Boom, right? So I'll stop there, right? That's my theory. That's my I've been involved in anarchist movements for about 17 years, on and off. You know, I'm not currently involved in any anarchist movements. You know, because there aren't really any, right? I think I kind of like not convinced by anarchist subculture that it is actually anarchist. You know, but I mean, it's something. At least it preserves something of the spirit of anarchy. You know, do you know what I mean? So yeah, I'm arguing for an emergent theory of anarchy as the better form and purer form of anarchist praxis. And I'm going to do two more videos on anarchist praxis to help illustrate that even further. Alright, take care.